Dakota death songs echoed through the air as 38 condemned Dakota men walked towards their death. The men were marched in procession through a crowd of 3,000 roaring spectators who had come out for the show. Guards escorted them up the scaffolding onto the gallows and began preparing for the hanging. White bags were placed over the painted faces of the Dakota men, a deliberate and final humiliation for the Dakota in their last hour. 3 beats of a drum and the signal was received. The lever was pulled, and 38 bodies dangled lifelessly to the pleasure of the cheering masses. The date was December 27, 1862. The men hanged were Dakota men involved in the Great Sioux Uprising.
The Dakota Conflict was the closing scene to a narrative of diplomacy between the Dakota Nation and Euro-American settlers that existed long before any blood was shed. It begins with early trading with French fur traders and develops into full-out war on the Minnesota plains, ending in the loss of over 24 million acres of Dakota land in the Treaty of Traverse des Sioux. In context, it can be seen as a model for the diplomacy of the U.S. government with Native people. The Treaty of Traverse des Sioux represents the brutally effective diplomacy implemented by the U.S. in land acquisition. For the Dakota, it stands as a great failure in diplomacy, and an even greater tragedy for the Dakota people.
Displaced by wars of the Ojibwe, the Dakota people arrived in the Minnesota Territory from the Lake Superior region in the 17th century. They adopted a nomadic lifestyle to survive on the plains of Minnesota and were a people rich with culture and art. Politically, each small community operated independently through cooperative means and under the direction of a leader given power by birthright. Though often referred to as the Great Sioux Nation, the concept of a nation never spanned across all 3 of the major group divisions of the Dakota.
Interaction between Euro-Americans and the Dakota began in the late 17th century with the fur trade. French traders made their way into the Minnesota Territory in search of beaver pelts that could be sold for premium prices back in Europe. The traders, powerless to the economic influence of the Dakota in the fur trade at the time, often created positive diplomatic relations with the Dakota by marrying into Dakota families and becoming a part of Dakota communities to increase trade. The traders also tried to level the balance of power by allowing the Dakota to run up debts that would be paid back later. Oftentimes, the traders would give the Dakota iron, wool, glass, and products such as kettles, guns, and axes before winter with the promise of being paid back in the spring with fur pelts. This history created a trust between Dakota and white traders, but as time wore on, debts became harder to pay back as animal populations thinned out from overhunting. The balance of power between the Dakota and the traders began to shift.
So you have a couple different processes happening at the same time. At the one hand, you have a long-term fur trade process, and the Dakota are finding themselves harder and harder pressed in that because there are fewer and fewer fur-bearing animals that they can trap and that they can trade, and so that the terms of trade are deteriorating.
By 1838, Henry Hastings Sibley, the original governor of Minnesota, constructed the first stone house in the Minnesota Territory. Settlers began pouring onto Dakota land, creating conflict as once great plains filled with bison were now changed into fields of corn, riddled with permanent homesteads. Euro-Americans were flooding into the Minnesota Territory, filling the demand for labor in a developing lumber industry and homesteading on the Minnesota plains. Settlement was restricted, but the laws were not often enforced, and as a result, white settlers were sometimes found staking out homesteads on Dakota territory. The Dakota were beginning to lose their grip on the most valuable resource in Minnesota at the time, land. As debts with the traders increased, the Dakota were now open to land negotiations, fearing that if they did not act, they may lose their land with nothing in return.
And second of all, they're also facing a lot of settlers. They're taking land, pressing on land, squatting on land. And so they're under a tremendous amount of pressure. And all of this eventually comes to a head in 1851 with the Treaty of Traverse des Sioux.
Governor of the Minnesota Territory, Alexander Ramsey, made the move on this issue to gain momentum for his political career. On July 23, 1851, representatives of the Dakota communities met with a group of traders and Alexander Ramsey to arrange a deal at Traverse des Sioux, near St. Peter, Minnesota. They eventually arrived at the Treaty of Traverse des Sioux. In the arrangement, overseen by Commissioner of Indian Affairs Luke Lee, Sisseton and Wahpeton Dakota bands agreed to sell most of their lands in the territories of Minnesota and Iowa at the total value of $1,665,000. Despite initial hesitation, the Dakota chiefs were eventually coaxed into signing, with the promise of land reservations and annuity payment from the federal government totaling $1.36 million. Only a few days later, on August 5, 1851, a similar treaty was signed with Mdewakanton and Wapakota bands of Sioux for the sum of $1,410,000.
The treaties themselves were extremely unfair for the Dakota. They included parts which limited funds to be used only for public works in transitioning the Dakota from their nomadic lifestyle to a more civilized lifestyle, something most Dakota people resisted. Also, much of the funds promised were fraudulently siphoned off by traders in payments of past debts. The actual implications of the treaty were a stark contrast from the opening lines of the treaty.
It is solemnly agreed that the peace and friendship now so happily existing between the United States and the aforesaid bands shall be perpetual.
Without payment in the coming harsh winter, the Dakota would starve. A trader who was at the treaty by the name of Andrew Jackson Merrick's responded to this cry by saying,
"So far as I'm concerned, if they are hungry, let them eat grass or their own dung."
He paid dearly for his words when a decade later in the Great Sioux Uprising he was killed. His body was found, and his mouth stuffed with grass. What motivated the Dakota to sign such an awful treaty was a shift in diplomatic power. As the fur trade declined, the Dakota ran up increasingly high debts with traders, which they could not pay. The treaties provided a chance to pay off those debts and improve their conditions. Put simply, the Dakota were no longer of value to the traders, and they were losing the diplomatic advantage they once held.
So they gave up a lot, and there's no way to deny that, and there's no way to deny the larger injustice of this. But what they were able to do was to negotiate something that, from their point of view, going forward, would hopefully put them in a longer-term, more secure position. What happened is the United States didn't honor the terms of their agreement.
The Dakota's efforts of diplomacy had failed. They had lost everything. Resentment towards whites built among the ranks of the Dakota, and they prepared for war. August 17, 1862. 5 white settlers were killed by 4 hungry Dakota men after the Dakota were caught stealing eggs. With 3 men and 2 women dead, the Dakota gathered. Tribal members managed to convince the Dakota leader, Little Crow, that the time to go to war against the settlers was at hand. August 18, 1862. Little Crow led a group that attacked the Lower Sioux Agency. Andrew Merrick's was among the first to be killed. The Dakota caught him trying to escape from a second-floor window in a building at the agency. The Dakota burned the agency to the ground. Following the victory, Dakota war parties swept through the townships of Milford, Leavenworth, and Sacred Heart, leaving them burned and their populations nearly exterminated. Dakota attacks on New Ulm and Fort Ridgely occurred during the following week. September 23, 1862. The Battle of Wood Lake was a decisive victory for the United States and was the conclusion to the Dakota Conflict. The Dakota had lost. At the end, almost 2,000 bodies lay lifeless, scattered across the Minnesota plains. With the approval of President Lincoln, 38 Dakota warriors were sentenced to death, a symbolic end to the Sioux Uprising and the Dakota people in the Minnesota Territory.
In the end, the uprising hurt the Dakota. Not only were they defeated, but they also failed to garner sympathy from the settlers. White sentiments had turned against them. Even Jane Grey Swisshelm, an abolitionist and advocate of women's rights, said,
"Every Sioux found on our soil deserves a permanent homestead, 6 feet by 2. Shoot the hyenas, exterminate the wild beasts, and make peace with the devil and all his host sooner than with these red-jawed tigers, whose fangs are dripping with the blood of innocents."
The land they were promised was now subject to further parceling. U.S. diplomacy had incidentally provoked this uprising and used it as a spark to ignite further Dakota wars farther west as settlers continued to roll over the native populations in ongoing expansion. The Dakota no longer had leverage for further diplomacy. For the Dakota, this meant their cause and their home was lost. Their efforts at diplomacy had failed. The individual story of the Dakota's loss of land can be seen in context as an example of a greater model of diplomacy to which land was acquired by the United States government from native populations. The narrative of the Dakota was but a stepping stone in diplomatic land affairs, much like the Choctaw, the Seminole, and the Cherokee before them. Their stories, all unique, but with the same ending. U.S. strategies for diplomacy were exceedingly effective in acquiring land for the cheapest possible price. That is to say, only if one does not account for for the immeasurable value of human life.
This land is your land.